The last seminar was lovely. Because I thought, with road traffic faster.
Yeah.
But it was absolutely miserable.
It turns out, the cab driver told me Wednesday and Thursday he goes to Michigan City. That's what he said. Do you want some paper?
Like 2 pieces.
Okay.
If I could have your attention, everyone. Are we ready in the back with the cameras? Great. Outstanding. Good evening, and welcome everyone to our opening event of the semester. Welcome to our esteemed panelists, our student professional audience, and to everyone who is live streaming on modernmoneynetwork.org. Our friends in London, Sydney, San Francisco, Kansas City, wherever you may be. You cannot join us for the entirety of the presentation. You can follow us on Twitter at The Public Money shortly, where one of our members will be live tweeting the discussion. My name is Raul Carrillo, and I am a second-year student here at Columbia Law School. I am a co-organizer of the Modern Money Network, and I'll be moderating the panel this evening. Before we get started, I'm going to briefly introduce our organization and our mission. We will then move on to presentations by each of our panelists, which will be followed by questions from the moderator, myself, and after all the speakers have finished, we will take questions from the audience and a few from our online participants. Briefly, Modern Money Network is first and foremost an educational initiative. The MMN was founded last year by third-year law student Rowan Gray, who unfortunately can't be present tonight, but is watching us via live stream with so many other online friends. The event was also co-organized by Jonathan Bryce, also a third-year law student, and it was based on an insight that was perhaps most succinctly articulated by 19th century economist George Friedrich Knapp, who recognized that money is first and foremost a creature of law. A theory of money must therefore deal with legal history. So this statement from Mr. Knapp kind of got Rohan and Jonathan thinking about what they had learned in law school about money, and they saw an opportunity for an educational organization, an opportunity to learn more, and perhaps just a little bit to teach their peers. After some study, they came across Roy Kreitner, who will be joining us in a later seminar during the series. And Roy Kreitner describes almost exactly the situation that our founders found themselves in. Imagine a student comes to the office hours and wants to study the legal history of contract, tort, or marriage. One barely has to think to get her started in the right direction. And there may even be encyclopedia articles from which to draw initial bibliographies. However, nothing of the sort exists for the legal history of money, at least not yet. You'll see that some of our panelists are trying to develop this and have actually made incredible efforts. So after this, Rohan, Jonathan, and the other MNM members started the Modern Money Network, founded as the Modern Money and Public Purpose Series. You'll see that some of our panelists today, Professor Dazan, Professor Ray, were here last year and spoke on some macroeconomic topics. This year's series is going to be just a little bit different. We start with the same simple but lucid questions. What is money? Where does it come from? How does it pool and flow? Essentially, how does money work? We think conversations around these questions reveal profound insights regarding the functioning of economics, polities, the law, and society more broadly. Last year, our speakers focused on a few themes upon which you may say that a money-based analysis yields some particularly exciting insights. Among those themes were financial reform, the historical evolution of debt, the analogy between government budgets and household budgets, the distinctions between monetary and fiscal policy, and the causes and effects of unemployment. The series was certainly not the first venue for students to be exposed to these questions at the intersection of law and economics, but it did have its own special flavor because the events occurred within a law school and started with macroeconomics. We have a quote here from Mark Kellman, the Vice Dean of Stanford Law School. When legal scholars and law students discuss the impact of economics on their understanding of law, they invariably think about microeconomics, especially in the fields of tort law, property law, contract law, but rarely do they think about macroeconomics. If one wanted to apply macro to law, one must wonder first, which macro? A challenge largely spared those who sought to introduce macroeconomic reasoning into the law. So this year, we are pivoting, so to speak, to the legal nuts and bolts of institutions and how money is designed, regulated, and how it operates within the systems. This type of conversation, of course, is very topical today due to the state of economies and economics around the world, especially in the last 5 to 6 years. Recently, we've seen some interesting voices start to ask similar questions. Judge Richard Posner said, shortly following the onset of the financial crisis, "Until September 2008, I had never thought to read Keynes' The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, despite my interest in economics. It was a work of macroeconomics, the study of economy-wide phenomena. Law, and hence the economics of law, did not figure largely into the regulation of those phenomena. Having now read the general theory, I have concluded that it is the best guide we have to the crisis." So interesting things start to happen when lawyers delve into macroeconomics more broadly as opposed to just microeconomic reasoning. It is our deep hope that you in the audience, those following online, lawyers and legal thinkers everywhere will take a leaf out of Judge Posner's book, so to speak, and ask structural questions about money and finance. Here's another quote from Bruno Salama, professor of law at the Getulio Vargas School of Law. "Politics is inevitably intertwined with economic thinking and practice, a trait that is particularly clear in debates over macroeconomic policy. Because of the acute distributional consequences of macroeconomic policies, legal scholars will most likely be increasingly drawn into considering their constitutionality, legality, and legitimacy." Our 4 panelists today have started delving into that nexus between macroeconomics and the law, in between the law and money. They've specifically all asked questions about the power and influence within monetary and financial systems. They're doing incredibly exciting work and are a boon to both scholars and practitioners alike. Without going too much into their biographies at the moment, we have Professor Dizan of the Harvard Law School, who's just written a very compelling essay on her continuing project, Money as a Legal and Constitutional Project. We have Professor Andy Ray from the University of Missouri at Kansas City, who joined us last year and will be speaking on the neo-chartalist approach to money. We have Professor Perry Merling of Barnard College and the Institute for New Economic Thinking, who authors a wonderful blog called The Money View on the Institute for New Economics website, and is also offering a great course on Coursera on money and banking, which you can all check out later. And finally, we have our very own Professor Katerina Pistor, who has just published an essay on the legal theory of finance. Professor Pistor teaches corporations and several other classes on law and money here at Columbia. So without further ado, Professor Dizan.
Thank you. Thanks to Raul and Rohan and the Modern Money Network, which I think is a great idea. It's really bringing light and exploration to an incredibly important topic, as you all know. Today's topic is money as a hierarchical system, and I think that formulation evokes money as a matter that's designed. So it seems to me exactly right, a proper way to put it. The people around me are people who have been instrumental in illuminating, making visible the architecture of money, so I'm particularly gratified to be on this panel with them. I want to talk about law as the method of design, the process we use to make money. By law, I mean much more than a simple technology. I mean the complex system of articulating, interpreting, and enforcing the determinations, public determinations about the way people relate to one another. Rohan asked us to talk a little bit about where we came from within our disciplines. I was persuaded early on in my law school career that critical approaches to law were the most powerful, and so that's where I come from. That's the kind of approach I use, legal realist or critical legal approaches. I think that will be evident in the presentation, but we can also return to it when we're talking. I want to start with the basic architecture of money, because my point is that if the basic architecture of money is legal, then everything built upon it is legal, right? If the very basic part is legal, if everything depends on the law, then we're starting from that legal infrastructure. So in a way, I'm glad to be first. I kind of consider myself building a base for the other speakers. If I succeeded, that would be my goal. What I want to do more particularly is talk briefly first about the beginnings of money. These are murky, we can never nail them down, but stories about money's invention matter because they inform our assumptions. That in fact, they supply our assumptions, they reflect our assumptions. When we look closely at the actual invention of money as opposed to imagining it, that invention connects money to governance from the first moment. So money, I would argue, depends on law from the start. Then I'll talk a bit about the modern architecture of money. We'll take a look at how the bank-based system of money is designed and see that it too is a matter of governance, a matter of law from the very start, from the first moment. So first, the beginnings of money, or the original creation story. Last time I was here, I talked the whole time about this, and I'm just going to recap it briefly. In that last talk, I contrasted two stories, what I would call the convergence story, and by contrast, the stakeholder story. So the convergence stories had a long tenure. You've all heard it before. The convergence story is basically that money emerged from barter. In the old days, there wasn't money. People bartered everything. They passed around all sorts of things between themselves: gold, grain, cows, hides, salt. And in this fluid mix of exchange, some things that were more commonly exchanged rose to the surface, like fat coming to the surface of a broth of barter. And in that way, we got a convergence on certain media of exchange. So in particular, gold or silver rose to the surface. People started using it as marker of value. They cut it into pieces to make the process easier. Eventually, the government began to mint money for people, just regularizing, really, standardizing what had come before. Eventually, banks began to give out paper representations of money. After a bit, people were willing to hold the paper and forego the gold. The government, again as a secondary agent, began to stabilize the resulting system, acting as a lender of last resort. So we could talk more about that story. For now, if you just focus on its assumptions, think about the assumptions that are built into the barter story. They look like this. Money is rooted in the exchange of private actors. They were the actors who converged on money. Money emerged from that. It's either a commodity, like gold or silver, or it's a convention, like the consensus to hold banknotes instead of demanding gold. The government's a secondary actor, providing technical services, not political judgment. As Carl Menger put it, no one invented it. Money is a natural product of human economy. There are problems with the convergence story, many problems with the convergence story. I'm just going to mention a few. First, there's no empirical evidence for it. That's probably because, second, the convergence story is circular. So in particular, the convergence story assumes the liquidity that it claims to explain. Just a few examples of that. First, the objects that appear as money in the historical record, most frequently shells, and tokens, metal tokens most commonly, are not obviously the most saleable commodities in a subsistence economy. So if we're really talking barter, we're really talking poor subsistence producers, it's unlikely that they will hold items of little intrinsic use, let alone hoard them or build them up. Why would anyone take the risk of holding those things unless, of course, they were money already? So circularity. Second, objects of value would need to be standardized in order to act as a uniform measure or constant unit of value, but it wouldn't be worth anyone's time to standardize them unless they'd already attained stature as the unit of account or as money. Third, the convergence story assumes conditions of order, contract and property rights in the materials transferred, but that assumes a polity or a community with the resources to enforce contract and property rights. The world of barter would not likely support a mode of governance that enforced monetary transfers unless the group used money to pay for that governance work. What really happened? What about when we look at the historical record? When we look at the historical record, something much more like the stakeholder shows up. So, the stakeholder story. From the beginning, people have acted in groups as well as acting individually. We see those groups from the start of the Anglo-Saxon world. They're loosely organized by family, kinship, around clans, loyalty sometimes. These groups are supported by their members, so people make contributions to a leader or a council. At the center, for example, military service. I'll call the leader at the center a stakeholder to remind us of the fact that these groups can take many different shapes. It doesn't have to be the state or a proto-state. It could be a religious community, could be a small clan. Money as a working proposition arrives when the stakeholder gives out receipts to mark a contribution given earlier than usual. So, for example, in response to an emergency, a small subset of men provide double the military service otherwise due, double the amount that they would usually contribute. The stakeholder gives a token to each man, and that man can turn in the token can give the token back to the stakeholder to exonerate him the next time military service is due. So if you think about that, it's like a receipt, like this token given to the man. It's a credit for a contribution to center already advanced. Only one more twist is necessary to make it money. People can transfer the token to one another in the meantime, to one another for value. That is, the person who contributed military service can give it to another in exchange for something of value, a sheep, give it to somebody else, and that person can give the token in turn of that person's contribution otherwise due to the center. Here we have money. All right, we have an explanation that actually explores how it maps the way money would come about. Money in this account is a mode of mobilizing resources put in place by a stakeholder who has now to run a war, for example, or has been running a war with the money. It's also, these tokens are used by individuals in the meantime. Right? The individuals themselves have a use for money and use it for their own purposes. The stakeholder story makes sense at many levels, and I will just name three: history, logic, and capacity. So, history, as a matter of history, we see money appear with political organization. I detailed this elsewhere. The network put a link to one paper that documents this in the Anglo-Saxon world. The point is that money comes with political leadership. It bears evidence of that authorship from very early on, both from the face of coins and from the manner of minting, from the method used at the mints. The stakeholder story is also a matter of logic. A group needs a money even more than individuals do. So if you think about the barter story, it's true at least this much. Individuals can get by with making one-on-one trades or using informal credit relationships. Groups acting through a stakeholder gain enormously if they can do that, right? It's much harder if you're a group to mobilize a military using barter or informal credit relationships. Instead, if you're a group and you want to mobilize, it makes much more sense to spend by giving out receipts, by giving out tokens, and then tax later at a time of reckoning, collect in, support the value of the tokens by taking them back in. So you've got a situation where you're spending and taxing. Finally, the stakeholder story makes sense because individuals acting separately don't have the same capacity as a stakeholder acting for a group. So a stakeholder has the capacity to make money. A singular location at the hub of society, that location allows him to mark contributions that are otherwise not fungible, not easily transferable between people. The stakeholder, because of his unique location, can mark them in a way that makes them standard. No one can trade military service to another, but everyone owes military service to the center. If the stakeholder marks that value or value of other in-kind contributions with a standard unit, everyone has reason to recognize that unit. Because everyone attributes value to it, it will exonerate them also from a contribution otherwise due. I could go on here, but I just want to mention a few elements, embroider this account with a few extra elements so that you can see how much it explains. In this kind of account, if you think about the way money operates, you'll see that money holds real value. So money in this account follows functions to exonerate a person from tithes, taxes, fees, or other public obligations. We could call this the fiscal value of money. A token holds more than fiscal value, however, it also holds cash value. In a world without a common standard or a way to agree on a common standard, in a world without liquidity, this token is liquid. This token is cash, and that means the token holds value for people for their own use. That leads me to the other element I wanted to address, which is that stakeholders can expand the money supply beyond that which is necessary for their own use. And they do. So in the early medieval world, they set up mints to produce coin for themselves, the fiscal use of money, right? They set up mints because they want to use money to spend and to tax. And then they allow mints to sell people coin. So in the medieval world, you can come to the mint and buy coin with bullion. Just keep that in mind when we're looking for the analog in the modern world, right? So you've got a kind of minimal amount of money that the state needs, the stakeholder, eventually states need, and then the stakeholder allows people to buy money for their own use, which they do because it has a cash value to them as individuals, right? They buy more than they need just to pay their taxes with. So where's law in this account? Law is everywhere. Law is making money in this account, all the way down. So law sets up all the relationships that give money effect. After all, the obligations to the center that are first marked by a token, they are matters of law, formal or informal. Taxes, tithes, fees, and other obligations that individuals bear towards their community, these are set by law. They're also enforced by law. If we don't contribute, there are consequences in a group. That's just the beginning. Working money is a piece of legal engineering all the way down. The token holds value because the stakeholder has agreed to take it at the time of reckoning. That is, it's a legal claim of service already rendered. It's a liability of the stakeholder, so we call the dollar a sovereign liability. Let's play that out another step. Some of the biggest disputes involving money occur when a stakeholder changes the value of a claim. That is to say, a stakeholder can devalue money, taking it back at a lower value than the stakeholder said he would at the outset. That action triggers arguments about the rights of claimants, right? The rights of people holding money, and those controversies end up in court, as you know. A last example, perhaps the most fundamental, the items that money can buy are commodities. Commodities, a legal category expressing the fact that something can be sold for money or alienated, another legal term, right? Sold for money. A community determines which goods and services can be alienated and which cannot when it decides what transactions in money to enforce and what transactions not to enforce, or what transactions to deny. The goods and services that make up the market are sorted out, in other words, when we determine what can be sold for money and what cannot. And that's a matter that courts do when they figure out what to enforce and what not to enforce. So land in feudal England couldn't be sold, at least not without certain conditions, right? Could not be freely sold. That's what we think of as definitional to feudalism. Slaves, tragically enough, could be sold in medieval England. We debate, continue to struggle today over what can be bought or sold, right? Sex, kidneys, children. Those debates about what money can buy are foundational to the market and to money. That is, they are fundamentally legal debates. Okay, that's the medieval story. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern story, because once we see that money is actually a legal institution, we can see that it can be constructed in different ways. So in fact, a lot of my work is focused on how money has changed over the ages. As money changes, the kind of exchange that is made in it and can be made in it also changes. So as money changes, the market itself changes in shape. Money, however, is still made by law. We can analyze money's design as a legal matter, and we can consider reforms to that design, in fact, an increasingly compelling matter. I think, 2008 is evidence enough for that. Modern money. Okay, so modern money appeared at the end of the 17th century with the first lasting bank of issue in the modern world, Bank of England. Here's what happened. The English government borrowed £1.5 million from a group of investors. It took that money in the form of banknotes, that is, in promises to pay silver coin which had been in the medieval world the unit account, the silver penny. It took the money in the form of promises to pay. These promises were issued by the bank. So when the government paid people with the new banknotes, they held a promise to pay redeemable at the bank. They also held a note that they could simply return to the government when they paid their taxes. If you think about that, they didn't actually ever need to cash the note. The citizens just paid taxes with it. The government returned the notes to the bank to pay down the debt it owed the bank, because after all, it had borrowed this money and now had motivation to take it back to pay off the bank. If you notice, it's a stakeholder story all over again. So as a matter of history, I talked about history, logic, and capacity that sets the stakeholder apart from random individuals. As a matter of history, the English government sets up Bank of England to create the first issues used as money nationally. As a matter of logic, it initiates money creation because it needs money for the war. King William is always fighting the French in these years, and the state has exceptional need for money. As a matter of capacity, it also has singular capacity to create money. So Bank of England notes are early on taken for taxes. Bank of England notes are the only banknotes taken with any consistency for taxes by the government. No other bank can compete, and the London private bankers soon give up issuing banknotes. But if we see the stakeholder story all over again, we can also see that the stakeholder has redesigned the money it's producing. So the differences from the medieval method of making money are in fact huge. The English government is sharing its monopoly on money creation with a group of investors. This is the first time it's ever done that. In fact, the government's now paying investors to create money rather than charging individuals for money creation at the mint. This is new. The government has borrowed in coin before and paid lenders, but it has never paid them to create money for the state. Money as in paper promises that circulate. At the same moment, we see a shift in the philosophical and moral level in approaches to self-interest. So action in one's interest was condemned, as you might know, as vice for centuries. Action in one's interest here is legitimated by the English state, and it's possible to conceive of a theory after this point. So the rehabilitation or the habilitation of interest, if you will, happens sometime in the 17th century. It's a slightly more complicated story, but not much more, right? We see it possible, it becomes legitimated when it's possible to think about everyone following their own self-interest, the bankers charging interest to the state, literally, and making everyone better off, creating liquidity for the community, right? So a whole new role for interest and for self-interest. Another difference, money creation is not limited by the metal supply. So under the earlier regime, assuming administrations kept coin at the same strength, which is not always true, they had to attract more metal to their shores in order to make more money. In the New World, the government can borrow to make more money. That money will hold value as long as people anticipate that it's good for paying their taxes. Again, I want to embroider the story just slightly to add two components, the same two I did in the medieval world. First, just a word about money's real value, and secondly, a word about the government's ability to expand the money supply beyond that strictly needed for its own fiscal operations. So first, money has real value. Banknotes hold a fiscal value in early England. They're as good as silver coin because they're taken for taxes. They also hold a cash value. They're liquid. They're made easily transferable by their authorizing legislation. Secondly, the stakeholder can allow for further expansion of bank money beyond that necessary to supply its own needs. Money's cash value means that people would be willing to buy money. You can see that I'm going here towards commercial banks. People are willing to buy money. The English government allowed people to borrow in banknotes. Basically, they allowed people to pay the bank for further money creation. This was the bank's private business as opposed to its public business. People could put up a promise of future productivity and collateral, and they would get notes, just as in medieval time they would put up bullion and they would get coin. So notice the analogy, right? Put up a promise of future productivity is like putting up bullion, but notice also the difference. Right? As soon as I say it, you're thinking, but wait a minute, putting up a promise of future productivity makes money much more accessible than if you had to put up bullion you'd already acquired. And it makes money creation much more abundant. So we see the beginning at this point of booms and busts in the monetary structure, a characteristically modern phenomenon, not a medieval one. No matter what you've read in 2 pages of Rogoff and Reinhardt, not a medieval phenomenon, only a modern one. By a complicated history, that business is taken over by other banks. That is, the private business of the Bank of England is taken over by other banks, first country banks, then joint stock banks. Joint stock banks are like our commercial banks. By the end of the 19th century, there's 5-fold more money with purchasing power than there was when the Bank of England was established. That's real balance, right? We're not talking about inflation. By the end of the 20th century, 70-fold more money with purchasing power, right? Lots of monetary demand here. Deposit creation by commercial banks now accounts for about 94% of the bank-based money supply, compared to about 6%, which is based on public debt, right? High-powered money. Okay, so what's legal about this? Last point. Everything. The law still creates and enforces all the relationships that make money work. So the unit of account is still identified and given value as a fiscal obligation. Law defines the taxes, fines, fees, and other contributions that moderns pay their government. The unit of account is still a sovereign liability. There are still controversies when the sovereign devalues its money supply. The courts still define what can be bought and sold, what contracts are enforceable, what contracts are not enforceable. Let me give a last example just briefly. Fractional reserve banking. So when economists talk about fractional reserve banking, they often assume that a bank can lend or give out claims to the cash it holds as if that cash were its own. But we can't assume that, right? That's a legal matter, whether the bank can give out claims to cash. Consider if a warehouse provided storage for your living room furniture, it could not lend it out while it was storing it, even if it could retrieve it the moment you needed your furniture. Okay? We need law to sort out the difference between a bailor, for those of you who are law students, this sounds kind of familiar, someone guarding your items, and a banker, someone who assures you repayment of money but can give out claims to cash in the meantime. We could also call the multiplication of claims to money, if it weren't legal, we could call it counterfeiting. And it is, in fact, representing the availability of the sovereign unit of account. If you think about what banks do, they're representing the availability of the sovereign unit of account, even if we think of that availability only as a claim that the bank would be able to clear that unit of account, right, in time. The government takes an interest in representations made about its sovereign unit of account. So it's a government matter, it's a legal matter. English law had peculiar approaches to money, facilitated the development of fractional reserve banking as legal matter. Nevertheless, it takes till the mid-19th century before we get this. So I'm quoting now from a legal case. Money, when paid into a bank, ceases altogether to be the money of the principal, that is the depositor, ceases to be the money of the depositor. It is then the money of the banker, who is bound to return an equivalent by paying a similar sum to that deposited with him when he has asked for it. The money paid into the bankers is money known by the depositor to be placed there for the purpose of being placed under the control of the banker. It is then the banker's money. He is known to deal with it as his own. He makes what profit he can, which profit he retains to himself. Right? Mid-19th century before we get that clearly established in English law. I could go on, but you get the point. Commercial banks are creatures of law. Their ability to engage in money creation is provided by the English common law of debt, originally. As we will see, they clear through a central system, commercial banks, and must in order to meet their promises. They also need access to the Bank of England, I'm talking about the English system here, as lender of last resort to survive. But even that is derivative of their need to clear through the central system, to clear their promises, which are to a sovereign unit of account. They are, in other words, embedded in the legal architecture of money. So, for that matter, are shadow banks in the ways that this group knows much better than I do. My point is we've built the financial structure on this monetary basis, which is a matter of law. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Dizan, for that wonderful foundation that you've provided and what seems to be a contrasting narrative. I'd like to say specifically for someone who's a law student, when you said that general principles about money seem to come occasionally, at least, before principles of law or of property and contract, rather. And I found that to be very exciting, and I think that says something about the pedagogy, not only here at Columbia, but in legal education more generally. And give me just a moment. I'm going to pull up the slideshow for Professor Randy Ray, who comes to us from the University of Missouri at Kansas City. And he is also a professor at the Levy Institute of Economics at Bard College, which informs a lot of our own thinking here. And I'd like to say as well that he was a student of the late Hyman P. Minsky, who is certainly a giant figure in a lot of what the Modern Money Network does. Without further ado, Professor Ray.
Okay, I'm actually not going to give you lecture 3 from my money course. I pulled a few slides out from this. Very hard to figure out what I should cover in 20 minutes. I was supposed to cover neo-chartalism. I actually don't like that term. I don't use it. It was pinned on us. I think it's far too narrow for what we're doing. So anyway, fortunately, Chris already went through the orthodox approach to money, so I don't have to spend any time on it. Anyone who has taken a Principles of Economics course has been told this barter story. And in fact, now they start with first graders in elementary school, as I found out to my horror when my daughter came home and was teaching me the origins of money. So anyway, and then we get the goldsmith, and the banking business develops out of the goldsmith, who, as Chris says, discovered that they could issue notes against the gold held in reserve. So let me skip to the modern case, because everyone realizes, of course, that is no longer true, if it ever was true. What we now have is what people call a fiat money. I think that this term is extremely misleading. I saw Rohan has a website of quotes, and I borrowed a couple from his website. This one by Neil Buchanan, who, by I think sheer coincidence, used to be at the Levy Institute with me a very long time ago. And I was kind of surprised he's become a lawyer, law school anyway. So here, I think, is a fairly typical view of fiat money. We accept currency or precious metals which have no inherent use value for everyday purposes because we think that other people will accept them in turn. This group delusion allows us to say that money is money. If the delusion starts to fall apart, then there are very real, very negative effects. It's no laughing matter to expose the fundamentally unreal nature of money to public ridicule. And in this article, he was ridiculing the proposal for a $1 trillion platinum coin. Maybe you remember that from a couple of years ago as a way to get around the debt limit. In any case, this demonstrates the common view. I call it an infinite regress. It's the Billy Bob and Buffy Sue delusional theory of money. Everyone is just deluded into believing that other people accept it, and therefore they accept it. And that is what stands behind fiat money. And it's so precarious. If people lose this delusion, then our monetary system will collapse. Anyway, the implication that comes out of the orthodox view of the nature of money leads to, at a micro level, economists talk about a government budget constraint. And the story of how this got into macroeconomics is actually very interesting, probably not for you, because you're not economists, but it came directly out of the household budget constraint. So it actually was microeconomics, the theory of the household, taken straight up to the national government. So the idea is that the government's spending is constrained by its tax revenue, by its sales of bonds, borrowing, and by its printing of money, new money creation. The last one is supposed to always be avoided because that leads directly to inflation and possibly hyperinflation. The second one is constrained by the bond vigilantes, and so really you need to focus at least over the business cycle on financing government operations out of taxes. In the political sphere, it leads directly to President Obama, who continues to claim that the government has run out of money, that we simply can't afford to spend anymore because Uncle Sam is broke. Macroeconomists focus on sustainability conditions, so there's a lot of math involved in this. We don't need to go through it. But we can point around the world to, say, Greece and other Euro nations, and sometimes other places too. For examples of what happens When you issue too much debt, you get in a vicious debt spiral because the markets push the interest rates up, which increases your budget deficit, which increases the amount of debt you have to issue, which increases your interest rate, and so on. We also have the Wall Street Pete Peterson view that the debt is burdening our future generation. So he's trying to whip up this intergenerational hysteria in order to gut Social Security. And then finally, we've got the Tea Partiers who want to constrain government, cut taxes, so that you can't feed the beast, right? Starve the beast by cutting taxes, and that will allow us to downsize government. Or you have the gold bugs who want to go back to the gold standard as a way to tie the hands of government. So all of these things, I think, come out of this view of money. So let me turn to the alternative view of money. What is money? And, you know, when we try to find the origins of money, we dig stuff up out of the ground. It's very hard to know what this stuff is. So I've got a rock here, and I think I showed this slide last time, and Michael Hudson wanted to correct me on the date. What I remember is it's 500,000 years old. It has scratches made by humans. What are they? We don't really know. The bones, I recall, was 50,000 years old, something like that. Much more complex series of scratches made by humans. What does it mean? We don't know. But clearly, these things seem to be recording devices. And so what I like to think of is that all of these things we're going to dig out of the ground, they're recording devices, okay, or tokens. The clay ball up there, these little tokens are inside the clay ball. The earlier stuff we can't read. The later stuff, like the clay Shubati tablets and the tally sticks that are shown there, we can read, and we know what they are. They are records of debits and credits, recording devices. Today, of course, it's almost all electronic recording of credits and debits. So, alternative, what is money? I reserve the term money for our money of account, not for the recording device itself. Our money of account is a state monopoly. It's a social unit of measurement. We have a state money of account. I think I'm the one who came up with the term modern money. I got it out of Keynes. Keynes said, the distant past, we don't know. But for the past 4,000 years at least, we have had state monies. So when I say modern money, I diverge a bit from Chris. I mean 4,000 years at least. It's a modern money. It's a representation of social value. In modern economies, you can point to almost anything and ask, how much is that worth? And people are going to give you a number in the state's money of account in whatever nation you happen to live in. Not everything has a money value, and not everything can be bought and sold for money, but almost everything can in modern capitalist economies. We then have money things, these actual recording devices. I call those money things. So coins are an example of a money thing. And Chris mentioned it, but Perry's going to talk about it a lot more. There is a hierarchy of these money things. Some are much more acceptable than others. They're all denominated in the state money of account, or at least a state money of account. You will find money things around the world denominated in the U.S. state money of account. But the point is, it is a state money of account. So the alternative view, I don't like neo-Charlism, it's the modern money view. The use of currency and the value of the money are based on the power of the issuing authority, not on any intrinsic value, for the past 4,000 years at least. These are records of debts. They are promises to redeem, and I'll get to what I mean by that. The state played a central role in the evolution of money as far back as we can go, and that is why legal history is so important to understanding it. And what we find is that the value of these money things was determined by the nominal value, not by the real or embodied precious metal value. Charles Goodhart says, as far back as we go in history and also all around the world, what we normally find is a one nation, one currency rule, and this is not a coincidence. It's tied up with sovereign power, political independence, and fiscal authority. And again, this indicates why we need to go way beyond economics to understand money and currencies. As a very shorthand way of putting it, modern money theorists say taxes drive money. Now, we know that that's far too narrow because taxes were never important until the last couple hundred years. Before that, it was fees, fines, tithes, tribute. It doesn't matter as long as it is an obligation that the authorities can place on you to make payments in your own IOUs, your own money things, what we call currency now. So the state imposes an obligation payable in its own debt. I'm going to give you three different paths to the same thing. The institutionalists, I come out of the institutionalist tradition in economics, always said that money is an institution. Dudley Dillard, I don't know if anyone would have heard of him, was probably the best on this. But even Dudley Dillard didn't get very specific, and I always wondered, exactly what do we mean when we say money is an institution? Can you be a little more specific? Jeff Ingham at Cambridge, I came across him years ago, and I think that he has put some meat on that. He says money is social in three ways. It's produced outside the market. No individual is free to produce her own money. It must be legitimately sanctioned. It has to be counted by those who count. He doesn't mean those with the capability of counting, but those who are important enough to count. Monetary exchange consists in social relations. Unlike barter, it always involves an IOU. So there is a social relationship there, a creditor and debtor. Today, the money stuff, what I call money things, consists in symbols of states or banks or others' promises to pay. The second tradition that goes into developing the modern money theory approach is chartalism. And you already saw a quote from Knapp. Here's a quote from Keynes, the Treatise on Money. He had read Knapp, and actually he instigated the translation to English in, I think, 1924. The money of account comes into existence along with debts, and he distinguishes between money and money of account by saying that the money of account is the description or title, so this is what I call money of account, and the money is the thing, which answers to the description, so that's the money thing. So that's where I came up with terminology. Further, the state claims the right to determine what thing corresponds to the name and to vary its declaration from time to time, when that is to say, it claims the right to re-add the dictionary. This right is claimed by all modern states and has been so claimed for some 4,000 years at least. So that's modern money, 4,000 years at least. The third tradition is Mitchell Innes, and what he did was to combine the state and credit money approaches. He doesn't, I don't know how much he knew about Knapp's state theory of money. He wrote two excellent articles, 1913, 1914, in the Banking Law Journal. Keynes actually reviewed the 1913 article in the Economic Journal in 1913. He said, there might be some quibbles about some of the history, because it's very early in the history of money, but I'm sure that the fundamentals are sound. Okay? So what does Innes say? And by the way, if you want a much quicker and easier introduction to the state theory, read Innes, don't read Knapp. Okay? Much easier and shorter. The state enforces the dictionary by imposing a tax liability. This is not a quote, I'm paraphrasing him. Ensuring the money issues denominated in that unit is generally accepted by agreeing to accept it in tax payments. Okay, and this one is a quote. The very nature of credit throughout the world is the right of the holder of the credit, the creditor, to hand back to the issuer of the debt, the debtor, the latter's acknowledgement or obligation. Now keep that in mind, because this is how he links the state money and credit money approaches as a universal law of credit, and this is it. Government money is redeemable by the mechanism of taxation. Okay? You redeem yourself. You redeem yourself when you deliver back to the state its own IOU. It is the tax which imparts to the obligation its value. A dollar of money is a dollar not because of the material of which it is made, but because of the dollar of tax which is imposed to redeem it. So, to summarize, The typical barter story is consistent with a neoclassical asocial approach. Sorry, if you don't know what neoclassical just means the orthodox approach to economics that's taught in almost all textbooks, in which money is natural, as Chris said, but it's neutered. It really doesn't matter much. Social power and economic classes are purged from the analysis. The market is exalted. The whole Robinson Crusoe and Friday, there's no power there. Okay, they just create a market where everybody's equal. The role of the government is downplayed. Money is a neutral veil that obscures and allows us to actually ignore the social relations. So my argument is that the barter story is false. As Chris said, there's absolutely no evidence in support of this whatsoever. However, it doesn't really matter. It's not relevant to any of the kinds of societies that we're studying now. It doesn't help us understand how money works. The heterodox, this is the alternative to the orthodox, approach locates the origin of money in credit and debit relations, maybe in Vergeld, which is Philip Grierson's speculation, or maybe in the Temple Societies, this is Michael Hudson's speculation. In truth, we will never know. But it identifies the social nature of the money of account in which credits and debts are measured and the social processes that generate creditors and debtors. These are things that are ignored by the orthodox economists. The store of value function could also be important because you store your wealth in the form of other people's debts. The medium of exchange function and the market are de-emphasized. They come much later in the story. In fact, we don't really even need them to explain the existence of money things, credits, and debts. We don't have to start with markets and a medium of exchange. So what are the implications of the alternative approach? Fiat money is not worthless. It's valuable due to the state's promise to redeem it in payments to the state. So we get this from Innes, from Charles Goodhart, from Abba Lerner, and from Hyman Minsky. Taxes ensure acceptability of the state's currency, the state's money thing. The question is, what do you have to do to obtain it? That's going to go into determining how much how much real value it has, how much effort do you have to put into obtaining it to pay your taxes. And then productive capacity ensures that it has exchange value. So fiat money doesn't have to rely on delusion. It actually has something standing behind it. First, a tax obligation, and second, a productive economy that can produce stuff for sale. Money and debt are inextricably linked. All debts are denominated in, I say, a state money of account. Usually it's your own, but it could be another's state money. As Minsky always said, anyone can create money. The problem is to get it accepted. This is the hierarchy of money that Perry will talk about. All monies are created as liabilities of issuers, and all issuers must accept their own liabilities. That's the fundamental law of credit that Innes mentioned. Note that all money is credit money, whether it happens to be stamped on gold, whether it is issued by the state, whether it is issued by banks or by anyone else. It's a credit money. The state money approach might appear to be inconsistent with the credit money approach, but it's not. Even state money is credit money. For the government, a dollar is a promise to satisfy, a promise to redeem, just like all other money is. How does a government spend its own currency? Today, keystrokes. Spending leads to credits. The government credits a bank's reserves, and the bank credits the account of the recipient. Taxes just reverse that procedure. Taxes lead to debits of bank reserves and of the accounts of the taxpayers. What that means is budget deficits lead to net credits to bank reserves and also to the accounts of the recipients of the government spending. What are the implications of that? Government cannot go bankrupt in its own currency. Impossible. Government can always afford to buy anything for sale in its own currency. Cannot run out. If there's unemployed labor, government can always hire it. The existence of unemployment is always a policy failure. Always. The only economic constraints government faces are full employment of resources and inflation. Other constraints are political and or self-imposed. Let me conclude with just a few quotes. Unfortunately, this one's very long, but it's very good. So read it online. That indicate that what I'm saying, is not so far outside the pale that it has to be dismissed as ridiculous. Okay, Beardsley Ruml was the head of the New York Fed, 1946. To summarize this very briefly, he actually gets to what Chris was talking about. Okay, taxes are not needed as revenue for the federal government or any national government that issues its own currency. Taxes do have a huge impact in the economy. Okay, they're not needed for revenue. They're needed, as Inna said, to drive the currency. But more than that, they have impacts on distribution and so on. Okay? And then he goes on to say that the dollars the government spends become purchasing power in the hands of the people. So government spending creates purchasing power. Budget deficits mean net purchasing power created in the hands of the public. So read the long quotes later. What about default risk? Alan Greenspan. The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default. This is Alan Greenspan. Okay. Here's the St. Louis Fed more recently. As the sole manufacturer of dollars whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. government can never become solvent, i.e. unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets, not bond vigilantes. Moreover, there will always be a market for U.S. government debt at home because the U.S. government has the only means of creating risk-free dollar-denominated assets. Let me translate. Government can never run out of dollars. Obama is not telling the truth. It can never be forced to default. It can never be forced to miss a payment. It is never subject to the whims of bond vigilantes. Well, how can we reconcile, what we hear all the time with what Alan Greenspan tells us? Okay. Here is Paul Samuelson. I think this is 1974. So Samuelson says, superstition that the budget must be balanced at all time, old-fashioned religion. We use it to scare people. The necessity of balancing the budget is a myth, a superstition, equivalent to the old-time religion. Okay? So we use this to scare people, to make them docile. Modern money view. Money is not primarily a medium of exchange. Money is not primarily a means of circulation. Money is a state monopoly, a unit of account. Banks make payment for customers in bank IOUs denominated in the state's money. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to talk about bank money creation, which Chris said is the vast majority of it, but it is all linked to the state money. Banks and shadow banks are highly leveraged, and then the contingent money claims are orders of magnitude greater than that. So we have literally hundreds and hundreds of trillions of dollars of contingent nominal money liabilities. The currency issuing government spends by crediting bank accounts, taxes by debiting them. It can always afford to spend more as long as it floats its currency. It doesn't need to worry about promises to exchange its currency at a fixed exchange rate. There are issues, inflation issues, exchange rate effects, and interest rate effects. Sovereign floating currency gives more policy space than pegging your exchange rate or managing your exchange rate. There's no default risk. You can control your interest rates, and you can use policy to achieve full employment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Ray, especially for outlining some of the policy implications for the modern money view. I especially liked your inclusion of Beardsley Ruml's paper, which shows that some of the ideas which the Modern Money Network discusses were at once upon a time perhaps not quite so outside of the mainstream. Next up, we have Professor Perry Merling of Barnard College. Professor Merling is also the Director of Education Programs at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, who partners with the Modern Money Network. Professor Merling.
Hi. I don't have any slides, but I do have a MOOC, and I just want to say hi to all of you who are watching from that. And there are a lot of lectures by me on there. So I have a challenge here not to repeat anything that's already online. And I'll try to live up to that. I want to say a little bit about where I'm coming from. Also, we were asked to do that. American institutionalism is very much a part of my ancestry. It's one I sort of discovered when I was trying to find ancestors, looking around. Perhaps a few different people than the ones Randy was mentioning, but some overlap. Alan Young was the beginning of my discovery of how to think about money properly, I felt. And that was actually the first reading in this MOOC. Okay, so a number of these students will have just read these 4 chapters by Alan Young on American monetary history. Followed by Alvin Hansen, who some people know as the American Keynes, Ed Shaw, who was at Stanford and sort of invented that language of inside and outside money, and Hyman Minsky. That tradition I associate myself with, and I claim that it is a tradition, that these people followed one another. But I link that also to the great tradition of British central banking, which sort of Chris was mentioning, that this where central banking kind of had its origin in a sense. And I start not as early as she does, but with Bagehot, 1873, and see a continuous tradition of thinking about how to manage money in a deliberate way for social benefit, starting with Bagehot. It started before that, but that's where I start. Hawtrey is another of the great names. Sayers, the LSE, Goodhart. Keynes is part of this too, but he's about some other things. So there's some shared intellectual heritage here on this podium. What I have taken as my intellectual challenge, really for my life, I mean, I've been teaching this course in economics and money and banking for 15 years before I got ready to film it and put it online, is the challenge that I call financial globalization. And that's the challenge of our day. I think if you're not thinking about the modern world as a financially globalized world, you're not thinking about reality. And those things, and what do I mean by that? By financial, I mean that the monetary system is completely intertwined with the financial system, meaning capital markets, meaning bond markets, meaning equity markets. It's not a separate thing that's about sort of exchanging commodities or something. It is part of the financial system, completely intertwined. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's a global system, okay? That thinking about monetary systems as just sort of confined within, I mean, it's true, sort of one money, one nation, okay? But the dollar is a global currency. It's the world reserve currency. It's the funding currency for everyone. And then they have to swap into local currencies. But this is the nature of the system that we have now. And that poses a challenge for this identification of my ancestry, okay? Because a lot of these people are writing during times of war or depression where the global system has sort of collapsed and it's gone back to autarky or something like this. I often tell my students, you can really get a better intuition about the modern system by reading Bagehot, okay, than by reading anything since Bagehot, okay, because he was talking about a financially globalized system with the pound sterling at the center of it, and this is true of I think Alan Young as well on the American side. So we need to go back and reinvent some of and reconsider some of these ideas and bring them into the modern world. Of course, we now have electronic trading and we have derivatives and we have all this fancy stuff that they didn't have there. So how do we make that relevant for how do we use these ideas from the past and bring them into the modern world? That's what I have been doing. So here's 4 things that I will just say. The central focus, I think, needs to be on the wholesale money market. Understanding what's going on in the wholesale money market. And by that I mean, by money market, I mean commercial paper market, I mean repo market, I mean the Eurodollar market, funds market, those markets. Not cash that we're using to go to the store and buy chewing gum, okay? That is true, consumers, retail, this is important in our lives. It is a very, very tiny fraction of what is happening in the world monetary system. So I mostly ignore it, okay, and focus entirely on the wholesale money market. A money market that is global, is largely a dollar market in its core, but is attached to these other markets. Viewing the financial system as a money flow payment system is one side. That comes from Copeland, flow of funds. Viewing it as a funding system. Shadow banking, in fact, I argue in my papers, is in a certain sense the quintessential modern banking system. Okay, money market funding of capital market lending is my definition of shadow banking, and I think it has been created because of financial globalization, not because of regulatory arbitrage, although some of that is going on. And we need to understand shadow banking. You'll see in some of my papers, I try to think about a world in which there was only shadow banking and imagine how we would regulate that. I think that's much closer to reality, okay, than thinking about a world in which we could somehow outlaw shadow banking and return to Jimmy Stewart deposit banking. I'm not going to be able to develop these arguments, but that's just to be a little shake you out of where you are. And now I want to say some substantive things about the system. It's very important to realize that the modern system is a hybrid system from the bottom up, meaning that it's part public and part private. You've heard some of this, okay? Part public and part private. There's a T-bill market. There's a market for short-term government debt, and there's also a Eurodollar market, and you can choose which of these you want to buy, okay? So the prices are connected to each other. There's arbitrage between them all the time. There's Federal Reserve, there's bank reserves that are liabilities of the Federal Reserve, but there are also a Fed funds market where interbank market where people are trading these things. So it's a hybrid system. It's not, and I don't find it so useful to say, well, there's sort of this essence of it that's sovereign, and then there's some kind of leverage on top of it of private. I want to think of it more as these things are sort of, there are multiple monies, and they're trading at par. And the question is, what are the mechanisms that make it possible for them to trade at par? Who ensures that? How does that actually work? When does it break down? What are the stresses? You know, for an economist like myself, when you see a fixed price like par, you start to worry. Like, how is that achieved? You know, when there's fluctuations of demand and supply, how is that achieved? I'm going to come back to that. So this is the first sort of idea, hybrid. Second idea, and this connects to some of the things that we've been talking about in the last hour. What is the nature of money from this point of view? I see money as basically means of payment. I'm not really talking about money of account. So this isn't sort of indirect. It's complementary, not in conflict. Means of payment, and I emphasize something that I learned from Hyman Minsky, which is what he called the survival constraint. Okay, which is that every agent in the economy is a cash inflow, cash outflow. Are you looking for me?
No, I think it's time.
Okay. Sorry about that. There was some official person waving. I thought maybe we had to evacuate the building or something. Survival constraint. So, when you think about money as a means of payment, okay, the question is, when bills come due, you need to pay them, and if you are unable to pay them, then you are out of business. That's the idea. This isn't about insolvency, okay. This is about illiquidity, okay. Having the means of payment to settle the promises that you've made, the purchases that you've made. Now, so cash inflow greater than cash outflow, okay, is the general constraint that we face. Now, some entities have the ability to force a cash inflow in their direction. This is what makes states special. This is when Randy emphasizes taxes create money, I think this is the essence of it, the ability to force a cash flow in your direction. That means that your liabilities are money. If you can force a cash flow in your direction, people want your liabilities because they want to be able to give them back to you. That's the argument that he's making. States are not the only ones who can force a cash flow in their direction, okay? There's private entities that can do this too. Not through the power of the state and taxation and so forth, but through other mechanisms. One of the most common in banking is that is if you have a lot of short-term assets and you just don't renew them. Okay, people have to pay you. They have to pay you, and there's a net cash flow in your direction. This was banking in the 19th century. The real bills sort of notion of banking. There are similar analogous things today. The point is that this is why the system is hybrid, okay, that there's multiple ways that people can ensure that they can force cash flow in their direction. And if you can do that, you can issue liabilities that have quasi-monetary quality. This quote that Randy gave us, that Minsky said, everyone can issue money, the problem is getting it accepted. This is the point. How do you get it accepted? It's because people need to pay you in your own IOUs. That's not just a matter of the state. Third point. One thing that I put a lot of emphasis on in my course is the central role of dealers. What is a dealer? A dealer, there are people who are called dealers, but I'm going to be using this in a conceptual way. A dealer is an entity that issues, that promises, that gives you trading options, that says, I will buy or I will sell, and here's the prices that I will offer you. You tell me which you want to do. Do you want to buy or do you want to sell? I'll go the other way. So a dealer is an entity that absorbs any mismatch in supply and demand, net supply and demand, on their own balance sheet. Okay, so that if on balance the world wants to sell, okay, I'm a buyer and I just accumulate whatever it is that they're selling. If on balance the world wants to go the other direction, then I draw down and I go short. Okay, dealers in security markets we're familiar with. I would like to argue, and I do argue in my course, that we should conceptualize banks as dealers in money markets, and security dealers and derivative dealers and central banks also as dealers in their own liabilities. And this, now we come back to this issue of par. Okay, this is how par is achieved. Okay, par is achieved by some dealer somewhere being willing to absorb fluctuations in net demand and net supply. And that's what you want to look for, okay, as you're looking around the system. That's the key price of money, in my view, okay, is par. The other prices are there too, the rate of interest, the rate of exchange, and this theory can be developed for these prices that do move, that aren't fixed at one, okay. There's more room for these prices to absorb stress. And I want to maybe wrap up. So the central bank is, for me, it's the central bank, not the Treasury, okay, that is sort of the key player in the money view version that I've developed, okay, because that's the dealer of last resort, okay. That's the one that is sort of backstopping all the other dealers in the hierarchy. And the central bank is itself, certainly in the United States, you can see, the central bank is itself a hybrid entity, okay. It is at the very same time both a government bank. Okay, it has responsibility for ensuring the liquidity of the treasury markets at all maturities. It's government bank, and it's bankers bank. Okay, it's providing liquidity to bankers coming and discounts and so forth. It's a hybrid structure, but it's not the same fraction of private and public at any given moment. In wartime, it becomes entirely government bank. Okay, and we see that in World War II and World War I. Okay. In peacetime, it becomes much more a private banker's bank. It moves back and forth. The balance between private and public is part of what's managed inside the balance sheet of the central bank. It's peace and war. I will just say one last word. In the paper that Randy wrote, or he was put on the website for this session, he mentions a very important distinction that Schumpeter made in his history of monetary thought between monetary theory of credit and credit theory of money. And I thought maybe he would talk about that today, but he didn't mention it, so I'll mention it. And I very much associated myself, I certainly got started in thinking along these lines by thinking of myself as trying to develop a credit theory of money. Then my PhD dissertation, more years ago than I would like to think, okay, was toward a credit theory of money. So I've been banging away on this drum for a long time. What I say now in my class is I distinguish between theories that emphasize the disciplinary function of money, okay, and theories that emphasize the elasticity function of money. Okay, the discipline meaning that you ultimately have to settle, you have to pay, you have to find a means of payment, but the elasticity meaning credit allows you to put it off for another day, and maybe then you'll have some cash inflows. So it's this balance between discipline and elasticity, okay, a balance that is constantly shifting that is the essence of the system. It's both. It's both discipline and elasticity. And the management of that system by the central bank is what gives it elasticity at times when there's too much discipline, and gives discipline when there's too much elasticity. The devil's in the details, but that's the concept that I want to give you as a takeaway.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehrling. Our final panelist for today is Professor Katerina Pistor, Michael I. Sovereign Professor of Law here at Columbia, and the Director of the Global Center for Legal Transformation.
Thank you very much. So this was enlightening for me also in many respects, and maybe I should just start by saying a few background notes about myself and how I come to this topic, but then also position myself on the panel as others I think have tried to do. So how do I come to this? I started 20 years ago actually studying transition economies, and of course in the later part of the last decades we started to find ourselves in a completely different type of transition at the global level. So I have studied in great details the transformation of the former socialist countries in Eastern Europe and Russia, focusing primarily on markets, on firms, and on financial systems. And have, from that perspective, looked at neoclassical economics and critiqued it a lot. And then when we came finally to the global financial crisis, I thought this was an opportunity to begin a process of rethinking the relationship between law and finance. I was lucky enough to get one of the earlier grants of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and assembled a group of scholars, and Perry was one of them, to develop case studies that would give us insights into how far the theoretical paradigms that we currently had, or at the time had, would carry us in understanding what really happened during the global financial crisis and how we should start the process of rethinking that. And that debate with 8 or 9 different colleagues, continuing debate over 2 years with workshops and exchange of emails and memos and etc., finally led me to come out and say there is a legal theory of finance, and here are the elements that I would put in place. So I'm starting a little bit more from the bottom up than the top down in comparison to Christine. So I'm starting from financial markets, but I'm ending up to where Perry is, in the sense that these are essentially a hybridic system. So the essential hybridity of finance is one of the core components of this theory as well. I think we can even show this institutionally. We can show this in the way the legal system operates and the different instruments are exchanged into one another. But I start with the premise that all financial systems and money are legally constructed. If you just abstract from money for a moment and you think about other credit instruments, they're all IOUs. You owe me something in the future at a certain term, and the more we're trying to expand financial markets and move away from relational finance where we know each other and can invoke reputation bonds and the like, the more we rely on the enforceability of these claims in the law, in a court of law. You can see this very clearly in our global world with international financial markets and fancy derivatives markets, that an organization, a self-regulatory type of organization or club of interested party, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, creates model agreements for derivatives, and it even tailors them to different regions of the world because it does realize that there are different laws in place in different regions of the world. And it goes out and lobbies 50 legislatures to make their bankruptcy codes compatible with these instruments so that they will be enforceable and therefore have ex ante the kind of credibility that they ought to have. It's all legally constructed, and the people in finance know very well that it's legally constructed because they will pay attention to law, particularly if they want to exploit gaps in the law, because ultimately they still want to have the credibility of being able to enforce their claims at a future date in a court of law. So it is legally constructed. First premise. The problem here is if all finance and money is legally constructed, but we live in a world, as Keynes and Minsky and others have taught, and Knight, of course, and have taught us years ago, we live in a world that is beset with fundamental uncertainty and the volatility of liquidity. Then the very fact that financial instruments are legally constructed can bring us to what I call the law-finance paradox, meaning is that we need law to construct financial markets, and yet if we enforce all legal claims as determined ex ante, we will inevitably set the system on an autopilot to self-destruction. It will implode, and you don't need herd behavior and animal spirit, and you don't need fraud and greed for all of that. Just the structure of this financial system has tendencies to self-destruct. Okay, so this is a core feature of the law of finance paradox. We can debate about what particular vision of the law I put into play here. Clearly, we all know as lawyers that law is sort of flexible, can be more or less flexible. I would suggest, however, that in our globally traded financial instruments, the whole idea is to make these instruments fungible and therefore to make them as rigid as possible in the sense that you give the other party who doesn't know the issuer and doesn't know the borrower at the end a credible claim to enforce it at a future date and to shift the risk of dealing with uncertainty to the other party. That's what this is all about. So what do we do when the whole system begins to implode and we are finding ourselves in a situation where parties are actually increasingly enforcing the claims in these contracts, and yet this brings down the financial system? That's what we saw, I think, in 2008, right? This is what we saw when people start sort of selling assets and making good on claims when margin calls come in and collateral calls come in. That reinforces the trend of the system down south. What happens in that situation? Then some agency steps in and makes the law more elastic or suspends the full force of the law. Okay? And that's what typically central banks do, which is, I think, why they are important locus of power in our world today. So whoever gets to suspend the full force of the law exercises power, it makes distributional decisions. Is the expansion of liquidity and relaxation or suspension of the law? Yes, typically it is, because it typically means that the central bank at that stage decides what assets it is willing to take and lend against. And typically it requires that it rewrites the rules of the game as it does so. So in the Federal Reserve Act, of course, we had a very open-ended provision that they can lend against adequate collateral, right? But also remember that the Fed explained ex post that they didn't rescue Lehman Brothers because there was no adequate collateral, but 2 days later they rescued AIG. It wasn't really clear that there was adequate collateral there, that this even mattered. They changed the rules of the game. Where you change the rules of the game, this is where power is located in a system that is hierarchically in finance, but also hierarchical in power. So these are the core elements. What this allows me to do, thinking about the law of finance paradox, about the elasticity of law, and then about who suspends the full force of the law in times of crisis, it allows me to start to develop a political economy of finance. And I think that's something where we have to go towards, because ultimately we can't really ignore power in this game. So I realize that we're just way over time and that we want to have at least sort of 30 minutes for discussion, but I just wanted to share a few thoughts I have with you about the euro. Because clearly when you think about the legal construction of money or finance, then a new currency that is being introduced in a region like parts of the European Union is a wonderful example to study. It is clearly a legally constructed money. It has a constitution, that's the Maastricht Treaty, right? Certain new institutions and organizations are created that have certain powers that are stipulated in treaty and stipulated in the statutes and that are incorporated in protocols to this treaty. So here, clearly in our modern times, we're not just having the legacy of monies that have been issued under some other different terms, but we're creating an entirely new currency union, right? So how to think about this, and I just wanted to share a couple of quotes that give you a sense of where I'm going with this. I'm trying to write a book on this, and the title of the book will be The Euro, Its Legal Construction and Political Consequences. So this will be about a political economy of finance and money as well. So I'm starting, of course, with the notion it is legally constructed. All financial and economic systems actually are populations of rules, structures of rules or process of rules, as Stopfer and many others have said. Let me just share one quote with you. When you think about how exactly is the euro legally constructed, you have to go into the negotiations about how it was set up. You know something about the Maastricht criteria. But clearly there was a very strong influence of the German central bank and the German thinking about central banking and the history of German central banking in the 1970s. And that was a very strong emphasis on price stability. Schioppa, a central banker from the Italian central bank, told the German central banker in the late 1980s, before the euro was introduced, your monetary constitution has been too successful in the fight for stability. It will now either become the monetary constitution for Europe or be contaminated by the sins of the others. That is, by the way, a very deutsches Schicksal, a very German fate. The quote I have from Harold James' wonderful book on the making of the monetary union. Now, the irony, of course, is on the end, this was before the euro was introduced, the euro is being constructed, but what we find out is that once we have created the euro, it is actually not so easy for Germany just to impose its monetary constitution on the others. But in the end, it finds out that because of the different structures and different systems that you can't just eliminate by creating a common currency, you will be eventually contaminated by others, and thereby also have to change the underlying mandate of the monetary constitution. But essentially, the euro was set up in a very rigid fashion. No monetary financing of the public debt is one of the big mantras, and that was what is haunting us in the euro crisis. The ECB may not buy public debt in primary markets. It may so in secondary markets, but it also has a mandate not to privilege public debt over private debt. That has certain consequences, clearly had the consequence that once we stood by and saw that different countries had to rescue their own private financial system in times of liquidity crisis, where you have to think about how to resolve the crisis, right? Suspending the full force of the law, making it more elastic also means that we basically accept other assets onto our balance sheet in one way or another to deal with the crisis. The different member states had given up the way to do this through the central bank, so they bailed out the banks. It's the only thing they could do. And some, like Ireland and Spain, for example, went full speed into a sovereign debt crisis because they had simply done too much. They had socialist private debt and found themselves in a sovereign debt crisis. In fact, not something that is so uncommon in the world. We've seen this just all over the world. We've seen this in all the emerging market crises since the 1970s at the latest. And so I think sort of thinking about the euro, how you have to manage these kind of problems that are so common. We're creating an integrated, interdependent financial system that under conditions of uncertainty and liquidity volatility will produce crisis. How do we deal with these crises? In arm's length relationship, when we are not integrated, we can externalize costs. We can all draw back to the core and let the system of others implode and see whether they can rescue themselves. If you're sitting in the same boat, like in the euro, you cannot withdraw. You can no longer fully externalize the cost of having an integrated financial system that will require rescue at one point in time. So I have another quote which directly relates to Perry Mailey's work, and I just want to say a few words about this, and then I come to power. An interesting question is where actually in a monetary union you have something like money's hierarchy. Perry has written a lot about money's hierarchy, and he has written actually a paper about this in the special issue in the Journal of Comparative Economics that we published about the project we did together. And here he has this wonderful sentence at the entrance of the article which says, the exchange rate is where one national financial system confronts another. It's also where one nation state confronts another. It's exchange rate where they confront one another. And so I asked myself the question, and where do the members of the Eurozone confront one another now that they no longer have exchange rates where they could confront one another? If you go back to the times before the euro, you had coordination mechanisms, their currencies, they had to adapt, they had to realign. These were always political confrontations, who will devalue or revalue or help the other. Once you have the currency, that doesn't really happen anymore, but where do they confront one another? And I think we've seen it. They confront each other in their differential access to international credit markets. So in a way, we're having a situation where in the currency union, it is sort of the sovereign credit that ultimately is the currency of last resort. It's not the money of a particular state, but it's the sovereign credit, and the credibility of sovereign states in the international system is what ultimately counts. Again, we're back to the hybridity. What is money, what is credit, and how does it play out with one another? Let me say finally, and then I close and we have a discussion about all these things, a few words about law's elasticity and the locus of power. I already suggested that the locus of power is where the decision is made to make the law more elastic, to suspend the full force of the law. Back again to the late 1970s, former Chancellor Schmidt had a meeting with the central bankers at the Bundesbank about the European monetary system, where Germany and other member states were supposed to commit in treaty that they would help protect other currencies from collapse. So basically legalize the realignment problem in a coordinated exchange rate regime. Central bankers said, we're not going to do this. We want to have an upper ceiling in this treaty so that Germany doesn't have to overcommit. We will never pay more than X. And Chancellor Schmidt says, gentlemen, I agree with you in substance, but you will never write this down. Instead, we will go along with the age-old principle of, and he says, there has been a beautiful saying in the world of 2,000 years, ultra posse nemo obligator. And where the ultra posse lies, one decides for oneself. So if you can no longer, you don't have to any longer. But that, of course, is an exercise of power. Germany at the time could say when it would no longer support the French franc or the Italian lira or eventually the British pound. The Greeks, of course, don't have the chance to say we can no longer, right? They're illegally bound, which goes back to hierarchy. You have more obligations if you're on the periphery than you have at the core. I pair this quote with one from Mario Draghi last summer when he says, within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. So in July 2012, it's the ECB, it's no longer the German Chancellor or the German Bundesbank that says, we will draw the line in the sand. And it does that against the open opposition of the Bundesbank, the German central bank, which goes out in the press conference. It's clear where the lines are drawn. And President Weidmann of the German Bundesbank says, you know, this is not what we're supposed to do. It's actually illegal. He makes the argument also in a case pending at the German Constitutional Court. It's illegal for the ECB under the treaty framework to do what is effectively monetary financing. They might not be willing to, they might be saying, and it's true that they're not buying the sovereign debt in primary market, but they're doing it in secondary market, but they're actually doing it for the purpose of debt relief of sovereigns and not just for the purpose of temporary liquidity because they will be buying in unlimited amounts. So I conclude then that section saying sort of for the time being, as long as the ECB has enough firing power, and actually it has a lot, just as sovereign states have a lot of firing power. Some economists have estimated that it has up to almost $4 trillion non-inflationary firing power. Until it has the firing power or until somebody really slaps it on its wrist, and that's going to be hard, you really would need a treaty change. This is where power in the European Union resides. Just as an example, to think through the different elements of this theory and look at the intersections between finance and monetary systems in a completely new setting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all very much. Because we are a little short on time, I'm going to reserve only 2 questions for the moderator, which hopefully will have you engaging with each other, then have you ask questions directly amongst each other, and then we'll move on to student questions. So our first question, and a lot of this is inspired by what's been going on in the live stream chat and on Twitter, is directed first at Professor Ray. You mentioned that all issuers must accept their own liabilities, and I'm curious about developing that idea with regards to the term borrowing. What is it that an issuer is borrowing after it issues a treasury security? Does that concept make sense anymore? And what are the implications for hierarchy if the government isn't really borrowing its own treasury securities back? Professor Dezan, I think you might also have an answer to this question if you'd like to follow up, Professor Ray.
Okay, well, conceptually, the sale of a treasury is not really a borrowing operation. It is transforming reserves, which in the past paid 0 interest, now pay a very low interest rate, to another government IOU that pays higher interest. When the government taxes, what we're saying is that it debits reserve account. So what is it accepting back? It's accepting back a government IOU, which is a reserve account. if the government runs a budget surplus and there are no excess reserves in the banking system, the budget surplus, conceptually what's going on is that the bonds will be retired as they were under President Clinton when we ran budget surpluses for 2.5 years. When they're retired, they're converted to reserves, and then the taxes are drained that way. So what is being accepted back is government's own IOU.
Professor Dasan?
So I come at this at a much earlier level. I don't disagree. In fact, I found the whole panel fascinating for how much we agreed, but come at things from our own body of knowledge. I think borrowing, so when I study the 17th century, when we get the beginning of public bonds, so bonds, the beginning of circulating public bonds is actually earlier than the beginning of paper money.
Interesting.
So the English government actually created circulating bonds in the 1660s and paper money in the 1690s. The reason I emphasize this is I don't disagree with Randy's point about the practical effect today of treasuries necessarily, but I do think that borrowing, the creation of public bonds as a form of public finance mattered enormously. So when the English, they create bonds in the 1660s, they're still refining them and trying to figure out what exactly the commitment to pay off a bond means. Originally, they're distributing bonds in return for money. Eventually, they're giving bonds to the Bank of England and taking paper promises. The institution of a bond as a legal instrument changes the way people think about obligation, for one thing. So, for example, to give a government bond is creating a legal instrument that commits the government to tax in order to pay off the bond. So it's a way of representing, it's kind of a second order commitment that expresses the government's commitment to tax, if you will. So part of money's value, I think we all agree, depends on its receivability for taxes. When that's represented, institutionalized in a bond, you've kind of represented to the world that you're going to tax to a certain amount to pay off the bond. So there's a change at the level of political theory. You've also created a class of creditors who are holding public bonds, so you've changed the political structure of really of your society by creating a group of people who are now profiting from and are willing to police the necessity of the government to tax and are also gaining income on the borrowing of the government. So there are these complicated and really interesting political economy effects from restructuring the way the government expresses its liabilities.
Very interesting. Thank you. Second question is for Professor Merling and Professor Pistor. You both mentioned a global dimension in your presentations. So if the system goes to autarky, so to speak, in a crisis, how global is it really? What enforces global connections at that point? Is it an agreement among central banks? And if that is what it is, what are the implications for hierarchy on an international scale or a transnational scale?
Well, during this, so just the most recent crisis, I coined a phrase, which I'll repeat here, which was forget the G7, watch the C5. Yes, that it was a basically agreement among the big five central banks to keep the system afloat, okay, that kept the system afloat when national finance ministers just basically couldn't get anything done. By the C5, I mean the ECB, the Bank of England, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Fed. Okay, and they had unlimited swap agreements with each other, and that is why we are still here. And now, having said that, I want to emphasize what I said in my talk. Okay, the hybridity of central banks. Okay, that it's not really right to think of these central banks as sort of agents of the nations of which they're the central bank. There's a sort of global quality to them, which creates a sort of political unease, because who gives the Fed the right to worry about global stability? Basically, it's nowhere in the Federal Reserve Act, okay? And yet it does. And all central banks operate like that, because there is a public good that is global stability, as a matter of fact, and they cooperate in times of crisis for this purpose. Whether you can say that's anti-democratic, and maybe it is. Okay, I'm just pointing out this is actually what happened during the crisis.
Professor Bistor?
Let me just add to the same point. Brad Sester had this wonderful heading for a comment that he published at the time, which was, "Where is my swap line?" And that's, of course, the question that you have to ask yourself if you're an emerging market, because we have the C5 that throw each other swap lines. And do we do this through a handshake? Here, law is really very interesting. When you look at the documentation of these swap lines about billions and billions, unlimited amounts of dollars they're willing to give each other, they're 7 pages long, and you can download them from the New York Fed's webpage. Think about swaps in the private sector. So at the top, we're actually doing things still in an old boys network through handshake, but you've got to be a member of the club. If you're an emerging market, you're on the periphery, and what you need is legal protection, and actually you are facing the full confrontation of fully rigidly enforced law, but at the center, these deals are being renegotiated. That's the political economy of finance, both domestically and globally, that I think we have to begin to tackle, especially as we ask more countries to join the international financial system and open their borders to a global financial system.
Thank you both. Any questions for each other? Okay, we'll open it up to the audience. Yes, in the front.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, as far as a question for Professor Merling, and this ties into exactly what you're all talking about as far as where's my swap line. So, Professor Merling, you said that during times of peace, the central bank is a private entity, and then during times of war, it is a public entity taken over by the government. Is that correct?
The word I used were government bank and bankers bank.
Right, a government bank.
Yeah.
So, given that that is the case, if you were to take away the ability of a central bank from a state, would you not be taking away the ability of in bonds? If you were to take that ability away from the state, would you not be taking away the ability of the state to wage war? And then this gets to the point of unlimited credit swaps as far as that, is because if you are able to have a C5, which you correctly point out, then what you're saying is that we have an entity that is beyond constitutional boundary of any state to be able to affect the fuel of the tanks of the war.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a deep question. My thinking about that comes from knowing about American monetary history, and that we didn't have a central bank here for a long time. We finally got one, and it was almost immediately transformed into a government bank to fight World War I, basically. And that was definitely not the intent of the founders. So it was not the intent of the founders to give the government the ability to wage world war. But that was exactly what it was immediately used for. And maybe that was a good thing. That was a good war, okay, but it was not the intent of the founders. And when the World War I was over, they hoped to return it to its original purpose and get the government out of the business of that. And it didn't really work. It never really did. The Treasury bill is the main asset of the Fed. At least it was until the most recent crisis. They sold off all the Treasury bills now, but and replaced them with mortgage-backed securities. So the private, one of the dramas, political economic dramas of this recent crisis is that we use the mechanism of war finance to save the private capital markets.
Professor Dezan?
I just want to remind ourselves to expand the notion of the public and public purpose beyond the military. So I used this as an example in the medieval situation because it's so obvious. But it was not the only reason that the stakeholder was spending, even in 10th century Anglo-Saxon times. There were aspirations towards creating just and public orders, including things like running a legal system, that took money. So part of why I think I emphasize so heavily not the hybrid nature, but the sovereign roots of money is to remind us that actually there are public purposes for spending that are just as important as private exchange. It's not a question of warfare versus and private exchange filling up the field. There are all sorts of reasons that governments spend that are enormously important. I think this connects. I think the modern money folks stress employment, right? There are many ways to use the public fisc that were important for centuries and were understood in rich ways for centuries. And part of what's interesting about the bank-based moment, the moment when we start getting money creation that is oriented around private investment, is that the private becomes so salient in that system that it makes private exchange look like the most important use of money, the main use of money, and the only governmental use of money left is, self-defense. When in fact that's really a distortion from, I would say, centuries of Western experience in which public purposes of spending have always been extremely rich and have been recognized and embraced.
Can I say just one thing?
Yes, but
Not really about the war question, but so we have a budget that is put together by Congress, signed by the president. That sets the constraint on spending, and that is where the issue of what we're going to spend on has already been determined. The Treasury and then the Fed then work together to make sure that the financing that's already been approved will get done. The only wrinkle in that we have is the debt limit. So the debt limit then says, even though you've already budgeted, you actually can't do it because of the debt limit. So that's unusual. Other countries don't have that. We've had it since 1913. It never mattered before until it became a political issue. But frankly, I don't see how you're going to implement what you were describing, because it's the budgeting process that decides that we're going to spend on the military.
questions? Yes, in the back.
Okay, you can hear me. So this may be a little bit to the side, but I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about pseudocurrencies and things like Bitcoin. And if you guys have any opinions on whether there are sort of reasonable, legitimate legal structures that might make anything like Bitcoin or other pseudocurrencies usable, other than the private law of contracts, and how that might affect other sovereign currencies, things you guys have been talking about for anybody.
Pseudocurrencies, local currencies, it's always possible, if you're in a group, okay, to say, why don't you and me just swap IOUs, our own private IOUs with each other, and forget about the rest of the world, okay? And you can do that, and there can be, and airlines did this with tickets for a while, and in the Berkshires they have labor units, and I see Bitcoin as basically like that, okay? It's not anything more than that. And I don't think that these kinds of local things are any threat at all to the global financial system.
I mean, I would add to that it has grown quite a bit, and it's not only localized in that sense, but I agree that it's sort of a community kind of currency. The big question is always, at some point, when nobody is any longer willing to hold this thing, who is going to bail it out? So whether those who have issued the currency and put it into circulation are willing to stand in for the currency, just as nation states will have to stand in for their currencies when it is under attack. So it depends on the size of the pockets of those who are backing the currency, and since they are currently private entities, and private entities have a hard budget constraint or survival constraint, they probably will not be able to stand in for the currency at some point, and that's when it will crash. This won't happen tomorrow, this might happen in a few years, and many people might have benefited from Bitcoins in the meantime, but that is, I would say, almost inevitable to happen.
At my university, UMKC, we have a parallel currency that we created 13 years ago or so called the buckaroo. And we drive it with taxes. It's perfectly stable. There's no chance it will ever collapse. It's 1 hour of labor is one buckaroo. There's no inflation whatsoever. Works perfectly. The problem with the Berkshires and the other plans is they don't have something to drive it. and they rely on a lot of surplus labor, surplus tables in the restaurants, and so on. So when the dollar economy is doing poorly, these things do okay as local currencies. If they would just get the taxes behind them, and so this would be a question for lawyers, whether the local governments could impose a tax payable in their local currency, whether that would then create the legal problem. The bitcoins, I see that as speculation, money laundering, drug running. So I think that it's much different than these other things.
Interesting. Question from Twitter for Professor Merling. You speak about focus on means of payment, but there always has to be a unit of account for this to be denominated in. How do changes in denomination affect institutions like central banks that now form the present hierarchy? Even in terms of just operations.
I'm not sure that I understand the question, but is Twitter able to
So,
give a little more?
sure, to make it a little bit more pointed, let's
Yeah.
ask, so if we, change the rankings of denominations, how does that affect which central banks or are sorted in the hierarchy, or which?
Maybe a general way to say that is there are always multiple units of account, and you as a private agent you can decide in what where how should we denominate this business that we're doing with each other. Should we do it in dollars? Should we do it in Deutschmark? Should we do it in whatever? And you can do whatever you want. It's that nobody forces you to denominate your business in dollars. If another better unit of account arises, you can make contracts in that. So I think it's not I think you need to be alert to that. And of course, there's also, when you're making a contract, you can also specify what actual legal regime is going to be part of this contract and so forth. I think it's very important to appreciate that private agents contracting have choice in these matters.
Interesting, thank you. Professor Ray, so we've spoken a little about the Fed's concern for global instability. How does that affect perceptions of Fed independence from the state government, or from the state rather? And do you see that as a good thing that the Fed is concerned for global stability?
Well, I do think that it's sort of the other side of the coin. If you're issuing the international reserve currency, there is some responsibility implied in that. When you're not in a crisis, you need to supply that currency, and you can supply it either by running a current account deficit, or you can do it on the capital accounts. You can lend it, and both methods have been done. The UK pound and the US dollar. So that's sort of the longer run responsibility. Then when the system gets in crisis, I think that there is some responsibility to act as a lender of last resort in dollars. So I don't see that as necessarily against democratic accountability of the Fed. I think it sort of comes with the territory. I think the Fed went way too far, but that's sort of a different issue.
Professor Pistor?
Well, I think, we can't have the whole cake and eat it too. We can't make laws in Congress and elsewhere to say we want to globalize the financial system. Our banks shall have access to the markets of other countries. And at the same time say, if things go belly up, we'll just go back to the home country and leave the rest to fend for itself. That would not only be morally problematic, I think it would be also self-defeating, because it is an interdependent financial system, and if many more markets on the rest of the world go belly up, so will the US. So it's a self-defense in a way to do this. It's not just an extension of its own sovereignty. It's the very logic of a system that wants to build globally interdependent financial markets.
Can I just make a pitch here for the panel? It seems to me that as we're talking, it's completely clear these are really profound constitutional questions about both the democratic organization of particular polities and the international global order. And we are used in law schools to thinking about separation of powers and thinking about the First Amendment, and in fact, the constitutional law of the Fed and of money and of finance, that these are constitutional law topics that belong in the law school curriculum. So we should have them in the curriculum. I would say even they're even more compelling than the ones that we've already adequately explored and continue to explore in the law school curriculum.
Oh, the Modern Money Network certainly agrees with that. Other questions? Well, it's exactly 8:30, and I think we've had a wonderful panel here today and a wonderful follow-up discussion. Again, this was the Modern Money Network in sponsorship and partnership with the Institute for New Economic Thinking, with the Columbia Workers' Rights Student Coalition, and the Public Interest Law Foundation. This was the first part of a series, the Law and Money Nexus series, and you can follow our next few debates on central banking theory, legal pedagogy, monetary reform, and a few other topics throughout the rest of the semester. Again, we're at modernmoneynetwork.org. On Twitter, we're at The Public Money. Thank you. Thank you all very much. It was wonderful.
So I just want to warn you, we're going to go to Morningside Hyde Park, which I think is okay if we go as a group at this time of the day. It's on the other side of the park, and it's like a neighborhood that's upcoming, and they have a really nice little Italian restaurant at Leaders, where we got a restaurant reservation at the time we wanted, and it's very close to the Ryan bringing it to Amtrak 34th station, just as if you took it here. So it's not no big distance. So you just walk down there when you get
Okay.
This was so interesting. Fascinating to read book on the euro.
Wow, I'm still writing it. I drafted like 4 pages. Chapters over the summer. We're going to have another year at least. It's been fun doing this.
We'll meet somewhere in the early 20th century, I think.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think what I should have said more clearly, and I wanted to forgot, is that I situate myself really in like modern day financial.
Yeah.
But we have both traditions coming together, right? And then both of, I think the money system will transform the government system set up.
Yes.
Along the way, but it has
Though I think that the way that you put it about the law of finance paradox captures the PowerPoint really beautifully. I have to think about it because you look familiar to me. I had never thought putting it that way because so I just finished up on this transformation, right? And it ends with the early gold standard. And it's so clear that they're constructing financial instability. That's probably the only and it's part of the legal system. In some ways, so in that sense, I never thought of it as a paradox. I actually think of it as part of the design of the capitalist system is one in which you're going to have rules that get enforced and include very deflationary, harsh consequences domestically, and also include rescues. I mean, there's a real distributive equity to the system, and it's not a question of a waiver, or if it's a question of waiver in your terms of the PowerPoint, is that you give the waiver selectively to the bench.
Right. So the conversations I'm launching right now, I think we're analyze Brown's network. I want to have a debate about safety. Not only finance, we have to rely on more.
What else do we have in here?
Yes, yeah. No, that's the
So
way
the
the
question
system's
is,
set up. It's
can we set up a
progressive.
system without creating all the moral hazards that comes to tell us about, but could we basically create safety walls so that early on in the system people would look back against the wall because the way we did the system could trigger some kind of renegotiation or reconstitution of certain contracts.
So that really goes back to Minsky, right? I mean, insofar as you know, part of his argument was the way finance is structured, right? That sort of the propensity for people to lend, right? And eventually drive a system to such a tip that the people at the bottom can't afford the rising interest rates. I mean, that really